Hello friends! In this video, you will see a manhwa called Elite. Please put a like and subscribe if you like this video. Let's go! The world before the creation of heaven and earth was a sea, and an island that embodied the blessing of the goddess who ruled in those lands. That island was called Santnara. In this place, according to the principles, beauty and grace were in the air, permeating everywhere. Every night, like a bright star, sparkled with luxury and hedonism. However, even in such a world, there was at least one cesspool where all the filth was collected. The slums of Kimor. In this slum lived a girl who was forced to pretend to be an unsightly young man in order to work as a shoe shiner. But alas, she was in debt to her employers, and on this night, they cornered her to get even. The men said she couldn't escape this time. She was silent. Then they assumed the guy was mute, and then they grabbed her shirt, and unbuttoning the top buttons, they saw the silhouette of her breasts. So they were convinced she was a girl. They laughed. And then one of them said that although she was ugly on the face, her body was beautiful and she could be taken advantage of. This made the girl angry, and she shoved the rascals away from her and screamed for no one to dare touch her. In her hand was a broken glass bottle, the sharp edges of which she was ready to cut anyone who tried to make a step in her direction. But the man who was her employer was stronger and pushed her in the shoulders, then exclaimed that he pitied an orphan like her, and there was no thanks from her. He felt sorry for her, who could only feed herself by shoe shining, and thought of forgetting what she owed him. But after this prank, he changed his mind. After hitting her in the face, the man told her that he was giving her exactly 1 week to pay him back all the money for his patronage, and if she didn't earn it in time, she would have to deal with men, not shoes, and he would simply sell her to a brothel. A few days later, the girl was hard at work in the Piazza San Celina, as she had been the previous days. 2 gentlemen were sitting on a bench, one of them reading a newspaper, while the unfortunate cleaner polished his shoes. She reflected on the fact that she had only 2 days of the given term left, and that she was still short of the money she needed. She was very afraid of going to the brothel, and decided that if that happened, she'd rather put her hands on herself. But she didn't have time to finish the sentence. On top of her thoughts, a gentleman reading the paper said he'd rather die than apparently have something happen that he didn't want to happen. The girl turned her hearing to their dialogue and began to look through the articles of the newspaper that were visible to her. The man told his friend that death would be far better than taking Lucretia by the hand and entering the ceremonial hall with her. Then he lowered the paper, and the cleaner recognized in him the universally known Cesare Bonaparte. He was the brightest star of the Santnara nobility and the protagonist of countless love scandals. The article said that Cesare had finally met his fate. She was the youngest daughter of the family della Valle, Lucrezia della Valle. The girl attracted close attention of the public, choosing as her husband Cesare, the only heir to Bonaparte, referring to the marriage contract drawn up by the 2 families in the distant past. The entire beau monde congratulated Lucrezia on the fact that her long unrequited love has finally borne fruit. After reading these lines, Cesare crumpled the newspaper in his hand and said that Lucrezia knew how to lie properly. Then he took out a cigarette and said that in principle from a woman such a thing was to be expected. Many of them are very cunning. The shoe shiner looked at the gentleman with surprised eyes, realizing that she was definitely not mistaken, and no doubt in front of her sat Cesare Bonaparte. Who would have thought that she would meet such a high-ranking gentleman in the Piazza San Celina? Accepting this as a sign of fate, she began to think quickly about what she should do in this situation. Maybe she could tell him about her situation, pity him, and he would give her a few gold coins, which were just pennies to him. But will she be able to say a word? Maybe he won't listen to her. Such a beggar. Meanwhile, Cesare told his companion that it looked like he was going to have to follow the same plan. The other man began to resent that the plan was nonsense and that it was not serious to believe in it. Then Cesare asked him if he had a better idea, and the man replied that they could find the girl and sell her to the Della Valle family. Just from that short phrase, the shoe shiner realized that this was her chance to change her life. It was as if the goddess herself had sent them to her. She jumped into the conversation and, placing her hand on her chest, offered to sell her. She promised to become the most expensive lady in Santnara. The other man asked what was she even talking about, and Cesare asked if the shoe shiners had forgotten how to tell the class of people by their shoes, if she dared to approach them. Then he added that she was mistaken, and he was not in the business of selling women. The cleaner replied that she was correct, and called him Mr. Cesare. She then introduced herself by the name Adele Vivi and said that she meant that she would be better than the others and could play the role he needed. The man asked how she had such confidence in understanding his goals. Adele replied that she realized he needed a fake daughter of the Bonaparte family that he could send to the Della Valle family instead of himself, thus not breaking the old pact between the families. Cesare was a little surprised and asked the girl how she knew about it. She replied that she had drawn that conclusion from reading the articles in the newspaper. In the marriage contract publicized by Della Valle, only the family name was mentioned and no specific names were mentioned. Therefore, probably, Mr. Cesare intended to get rid of the bonds of political marriage, deceiving everyone, buying a girl and calling her a secret daughter of the Bonaparte family. And a girl was certainly needed, for among the heirs of the Della Valle family, besides Mrs. Lucrezia, her elder brother was unmarried. The young man sitting next to Cesare, whose name was Jude, marveled at Adele's cleverness, who could make such an analysis from scraps of newspaper. Carassa replied that they were just wasting their time. He said that the Della Valle family had been known for centuries to produce great scholars, and they were not the kind of people to give away a shoeshiner who could barely read. Adele asked, what if she didn't just barely know how to read? Cesare froze, realizing that she had asked the question in another language. It was the language of the Dinan. The girl said she also knew the language of Algiers. Jude watched the dialogue between the two people in different languages with interest. Cesare then asked how she was able to learn all these languages. Adele replied that she had read books in the public library and glimpsed the speeches of foreigners. Cesare clutched his head, amazed that someone could learn languages only by occasionally listening to foreigners speaking in the streets, and added with a chuckle that he felt like he was being played by a sea goddess. Adele had already had some hope that she had been able to convince them, but Cesare, calling her by name, said that the point was that his sister had to be not only clever, but also very handsome, like him. After all, she had to look pretty to sell. That was the most important point to please the eldest son of the Della Valle family. He stood up along with Jude and walked past, saying she was not suitable. Adele asked them to stop, threw off the cap under which she hid her long hair, which was a sea wave color, even a deeper emerald, and pulled the false rippled cheeks off her face. Underneath all that makeup was an incredibly beautiful girl. She hid her appearance so that the men from the slums would not pester her and force her into a brothel, where such parameters were highly valued. Adele turned around and asked Cesare if he was ready to disqualify her now. Jude said that when Adele had suggested pretending to be Cesare's sister, he'd thought it was nonsense, but looking closer now, he saw that they did look alike. Their eyes were both yellow in color, and their hair was almost the same shade of sea, only Cesare's was more blue and Adele's green. Wasn't that the perfect match? Cesare skeptically asked the girl if she was not a noblewoman. She replied that she wasn't. Then he asked who her parents were. Adele said there was no point in asking that of an orphan. Cesare pondered for a while and said that in that case he was indeed curious. It's not like Adele was a common fool who didn't realize that if she was exposed, she would be killed immediately. So why did she need to do this? Without emotion on her face, Adele answered that she was just hungry. Cesare turned his back to her and replied that whatever it was, he was sending her away. This was also said in a foreign language. Adele, placing her hand on his chest again, answered him that they would meet again in the same place where they desired each other. Cesare grinned as he heard the continuation of the quote from Dante's play and thought that he had found an extremely useful woman. He then told her to come to the Bonaparte estate until tomorrow noon. In the evening of the same day, Adele, again disguised and hiding her hair under her cap, sat on the floor of the shanty in which she usually slept. She rolled up her belongings, which were probably just a mattress, and hugged her knees, unable to believe that there was a chance to get out of this hell. She couldn't believe that Cesare Bonaparte had actually accepted her offer, and in the days to come she would live like a noblewoman. No longer would she have to worry about being turned into a brothel. The only thing she longed for was her friend with whom they had lived together at the orphanage. A sunny, blonde-haired girl named Clarice. Adele would miss her, and she was sorry they couldn't meet before she left and say goodbye. Clarice was busy, so the girl wrote everything to her in a letter that she was going to send when she went to the mansion. Suddenly, someone started banging on the door. The door swung open and the employer came inside. He said he knew she intended to run away without paying for the patronage. He grabbed her by the elbow and wanted to drag her behind him. The girl broke free and climbed onto the table toward the window. The man demanded that she come to him and ran after her, trying to grab her by the shirt, yelling that she dare not run from him. Cesare's words from the afternoon's question replayed in Adele's mind. If she's declassified, she'll be killed instantly. So what does she need it for? She didn't care if she died if she could escape from here. At least live like a human for a little while without worrying about getting a piece of bread in the filthy slums. For that, she didn't spare her life. She jumped out of the window and ran as fast as she could. In the pouring rain, her makeup slipped off, she lost her cap, and after a while she managed to reach the mansion in a disheveled state, completely soaked with her hair loose, shirt and pants. The butler greeted her and told her they were expecting her. The man's name was Ernst. He opened the gate and said the head of the estate was expecting her. Adele walked into Cesare's study and bashfully lowered her gaze to the floor. Seeing the dirty and drenched girl, the man, pretending to call her his favorite little sister, asked how come she was soaking wet and asked her to share like an older brother. The girl replied that Mr. Nino, her employer who ran a bunch of shoe shiners in Kimura, was harassing her because of overdue patronage fees. She was about to add that he would not stop the harassment, but Cesare interrupted her and said that the old man was already dead. The girl was taken aback by the words she heard. Cesare said that it had been a terrible downpour today, and as he heard, because of such a heavy rain, one of the shacks in Kimura could not withstand and collapsed, and inside was the same Mr. Nino. Death due to an accident in the slums is quite common. Afterward, he asked Adele if there were any other people who were annoying her and able to interfere with them. Obviously, the accident was no such thing at all, and Cesare had been directing surveillance on the girl since their first meeting, after which he had removed one of the obstacles in the form of her patron demanding a debt. Adele understood that, and it seemed to her that the question asked referred to Clarice. But the girl answered that there was no one else in the way. She was afraid for her friend, to whom she wanted to tell everything, but she was afraid of Cesare. It was necessary to keep everything secret and to protect her friend from him. Cesare said she had nothing to worry about as long as the plan didn't go wrong, but it would be better if it didn't. Then he said that now that all the business was taken care of, they should move on to the main thing. The objective was already known. Adele was to seduce Della Valle's son and marry him, and starting from body and mind, manner of speaking, and ending with the tips of her fingers and toes, the girl was obliged to become perfect Buonaparte, so that no one would doubt that she was not his sister. She must become a true noble woman and fool the whole of Fornati society. Afterward, Caesar smoked and said he would give her a period of 3 months to prepare. If in that time she could not become a lady he would recognize, the plan would go to the dustbin. A thought popped into Adele's head. If the plan goes to the dumpster, won't she follow in it? All she said in response was that she understood him. Cesare then asked if she would even ask why he was giving her exactly 3 months. Adele replied that she assumed it was because Mr. Cesare had planned to fit it in with the date of his birthday reception. Cesare replied that it was exactly that, and then got up from the table and walked over to the girl. He said she had a real talent for uncovering his plans from newspaper articles alone, and he felt as if she knew even more about his family than he did. Grabbing Adele by the chin, Cesare said there had to be a reason for that after all. Maybe she was interested in him. Cesare said he understood her feelings completely. And for a slum dweller with only a face, a newfound brother must seem like a mission to which one would want to attach oneself. But he decided to warn Adele that he did not wish to see her in his bedroom in the middle of the night. The girl calmly thanked him for his advice and added that she was not interested in him at all. Adele thought to herself that although he was handsome, he seemed crazy. Cesare laughed and said that the girl's face at that moment was very funny. He then stepped back and explained that he warned for the reason that something like this had happened to him before. Adele, calling the man a gentleman, said she would keep that in mind. Cesare told her that from now on she should not call him sir, but brother even when they were alone together. Adele immediately said she understood, calling him what he asked. Cesare praised his sister and added that from now on her name is Adelaide Buonaparte. She is younger than him by 5 years, and all this time lived in distant Capallo, somewhere across the sea, considering herself a commoner, and suddenly, for some reason, she decided to come here alone. Adele thought that it turns out, explaining the reason why she became Buonaparte, she would have to adjust to the situation. Was that Cesare's intention? She asked her brother if he intended to initiate the chairwoman into the plan. Cesare's grandmother and president of the Signoria. The local parliament, Eva Buonaparte, was incredibly influential. Without her consent, it was impossible to even begin planning such a thing. The man replied that he was sorry, but he couldn't tell her. The dearest Mrs. Eva was so eager to see her grandchildren that she was ready to receive Lucretia with open arms. It turned out that the chairwoman supported their marriage. Caesar asked Adele if she was interested in anything else. It seemed to him that the most important thing had been left out. His parents. Since Adele was going to pretend to be his own sister, wouldn't it be worth finding out about them? Adele herself was surprised and asked again, as if there was no point in her inquiring about it herself. Would there be a single person in Santnara who didn't know? Rumor had it that Caesar's parents, mad with love for each other, had run away, abandoning both their families and their young child. Adele replied that she had only heard that the year Caesar turned 9, they had moved away. Cesare said that in that case, no further explanation would be needed. Then he suggested telling people that his parents had gone insane a second time and had given birth to her, and that would be the end of it for the day. Cesare opened the door of his study and letting his sister out, said that a maid would be waiting for her in the corridor, whom she must follow, and calling her once more Adelaide Buonaparte, then said that he would like to believe that the next time they met, she would be able to display an image more befitting a lady, and he would look forward to seeing great progress in her changes. Adele promised her brother to do her best. The maid bowed to the girl and said she was honored to serve her, Lady Adelaide. Her name was Afoni Cora, and she was the governess appointed for her. She ushered Adele into a room and told her it was her bedroom. The room shone with brilliance. The sets, the curtains, everything was bright, pearly, and very clean. Afoni had said that the Bonaparte rejected luxury, so the decoration could not be called luxurious, but the girl would still be comfortable here. Although she herself agreed that it was too modest for a lady's quarters. Adele was amazed that such an interior was not luxurious, and by the standards of nobles, on the contrary, quite modest. She had never seen anything more beautiful, and she couldn't even think that she would ever live in such a bedroom. Afoni added that the girl should address her freely, and in no way her equal. And from tomorrow, etiquette classes would begin. So if Madame Adelaide catches cold due to hypothermia, it will be a big problem. She escorted Mistress to the bathroom and said she would help her take it. Adelaide replied that she could wash herself, but Afoni said that aristocrats never wash themselves, exclusively with the help of servants. Adelaide wanted to argue, but the maid said her words were not a request. Reluctantly, the girl took off her pants and shirt. She wasn't at all embarrassed of her body. She didn't want her bruises to be seen. Her entire body was covered in purple stains. Afoni didn't have time to say anything before Adele anxiously exclaimed that the bruises would come off soon. She knew this because she was beaten regularly and old bruises always came off quickly, and afterwards she asked the maid if she would report it. The thought crept into her head that Caesar would think her body was ugly and break the contract. Afoni said the contract between Adelaide and Mr. Cesare would end after she married Della Valle's son. Until then, all it will take is not to be exposed by the young lord of their kind. So, with proper care, the bruises would have time to heal. Adele sighed and said, "Thank the goddess." Afoni turned her back to her and added that although the wounds would heal, the girl was too gaunt. So the focus now should be on regaining her health. After all, she was now Lady Buonaparte. With those words, Afoni threw rose petals into the bathtub. After the bath, the maid left her mistress and came to Mr. Cesare's study. He asked the faithful maid what opinion she had of his sister. The woman said that the state of her health left much to be desired. There were also many marks from beatings on her body. Caesar said to this that the chipped pearl was practically worthless. Afoni added that these were injuries that with consistent treatment would completely come off and leave no scars. And when the lady gains some weight, her beauty will outshine many. Cesare said the girl was very beautiful even now. He even felt a little sorry that they were now related. Afoni got annoyed at those words. Cesare smiled and told her that she could not worry, he would not touch Adele. After all, she would die anyway once his problem was resolved. Adele woke up in the middle of the night, out of old habit. When she lived in the orphanage, and in the slums, sleep was sensitive to going on the run at any moment if someone got to you to do harm. She walked over to the window that overlooked the sea and noticed that ships were returning to shore with their catch. Usually it was about this time that the fishing boats that had been working all night came into the harbor. Soon, some fishermen would start giving away the fish they couldn't sell to the needy. She herself woke up at dawn every day, staggering around the marina hoping to make it in time for the distribution. And now her life was luxurious. She still couldn't believe it. With longing and anxiety, Adele asked herself, could she handle everything with dignity? Realizing that it was unlikely that she would be able to sleep yet, the girl picked up a book lying on the table and lay in bed to read. as she leafed through page after page. The girl didn't notice that morning had come and Ifoni had entered the room. She noticed that the mistress was already awake. Adele, who could only call herself that in private and turned into Adelaide as the day wore on, said she had just woken up early enough that she couldn't go back to sleep. Putting the book aside, the girl asked what she should do now. Ifoni was glad that the mistress was enthusiastic. From today, there would not be a single free hour in her schedule. However, they would start with a meal. Breakfast was rich, the long table was bursting with treats. Ifoni pulled back a chair and asked Madame to sit down, then asked if she had any food preferences. Adelaide replied that she didn't really like rotten things, but in general, anything would do. She could even eat insects. Ifoni decided to let those words pass her ears, and commented that it was a good thing she wasn't picky like some of the other ladies. It was a good quality for a noble lady. She then began to recount and explain that table etiquette was one of the mandatory skills for nobles. One could call it the foundation of the basics. Starting a meal, one should always use the utmost utensils. It is also necessary to keep the posture and lift the chin up, and the elbows should not touch the table. It is not allowed to keep both hands under the table during a meal. Adelaide nodded and repeated all the instructions. Ifoni told the girl she was doing great and offered to taste the food. Setting a piece of meat on her fork, Adele tasted it and glowed as if with true happiness. She had never eaten such delicious food. Her cheeks flushed and her eyes sparkled. Continuing to observe all the rules of etiquette, Adele began to actively try one dish after another. Ifoni sounded out each of the dishes. The first was beef carpaccio with arugula and celery, followed by linguine with mackerel and abalone, halibut with potato gratin and tomato sauce. Adele was ready to lick her plate. It was so good, but then she came to her senses and wondered if she had eaten too greedily, like a vagrant. But Ifoni reassured her, saying she was glad to see that the lady had a good appetite. For a while, she should eat more than 4 meals a day, as a noble lady must be in body. This news made Adele happy. She would finally be able to eat enough for all the years she had been starving. After breakfast, Ifoni gave Mrs. Adelaide a tour of the mansion. She showed the library, reception room, art gallery, billiard room, refectory, and many other rooms. In the central area of the first floor was the young master's office. Ifoni had warned the girl that if for any reason she needed to visit the young master, she should definitely enter without knocking. That was the rule of the mansion. Adelaide asked if there was anything else she should watch out for. Ifoni thought for a moment and replied that it was better to report it at once. The circle of people who knew about the contract between Adele and Cesare included only 6 people, including Ifoni. However, in a few days that number would increase to 7, and that person would be the etiquette teacher, Madame Flavia. She is somewhat strict, but at the same time Madame has the best competence, so one must listen to her very carefully. Adelaide asked the maid how she should greet Madame Flavia the first time she met her. Ifoni replied that that was correct. They should now learn the bow adopted at Fornati. Holding the skirt with one hand, one should bend the legs slightly at the knees while keeping the back straight, and bow the head. Adelaide repeated the bow perfectly the first time. Ifoni told her mistress that she looked ravishing, and she grasped everything on the fly. When evening came, Adelaide went to bed. Ifoni lit a candle and wished mistress for the night that the sea goddess would protect her sleep. The girl wished her the same in return. As the door slammed shut, Adele relaxed and listened to the silence. The silence brought calmness. The shouting and noise that was her eternal companion in Kimura would not reach here. It turns out there is a world where it is so peaceful and good. Eating a hot meal and sleeping in silence is commonplace for some. She felt this happiness and fell soundly asleep. But the dream was disturbing. The waves of the sea were turning into a real storm and crashing down on her, and some inner voice, calling Adele by name, shouted for her to run away as soon as possible. The girl opened her eyes, frightened by the nightmare. At that moment, Ifoni burst into the room and shouted to the mistress that they were in trouble. They must hurry. Madame Flavia had unexpectedly arrived at the mansion for a visit. Ifoni handed the girl a robe, telling her that they had no time at all to get ready. They should at least put something on first. Sleepy Adelaide didn't realize what was going on. At that moment, Madame Flavia herself entered the room without any knock. A noble old family that had served Buonaparte for generations was Lorendin. But undoubtedly, Flavia Lorendin was the loudest name in social circles. First, she was known for the fact that due to its beauty and elegance resembled a work of art. And secondly, she was known for her stroppy temper and excessive severity in teaching young ladies. Just entering the bedroom, Madame Flavia cried out that it was sheer shamelessness that the girl was still unclothed, although she had appeared early in the morning. Adelaide lowered her head and apologized, explaining that she was in as much of a hurry as she could. Me. Flavia shouted back that no one had allowed the young lady to speak. She resented that she had to teach something to this girl who had no manners at all. Adele thought in her mind that she didn't understand what this woman wanted from her if she herself forbade her to speak. At this moment, Mr. Bonaparte himself appeared at the door. Cesare told Madame Flavia that, if etiquette had been known to his sister, she would not have been called. And afterwards he added that he had not thought Madame would visit them so early. Madame Flavia took off her hat and approached Mr. Cesare, asking him to let her say something. The man replied that he would begin by greeting the dear madam and kiss the woman on the cheek, putting his arm around her shoulders. Afterward, he asked her if she had gotten a good night's sleep last night. The indignant and angry Madame Flavia replied that of course she had, but Cesare interrupted her, saying that it was fortunate and he would be even happier if they joined him for breakfast. Except he wasn't sure if Madame would have the time. Madame Flavia replied that of course since she was invited by her master, she was free for him at any moment. Because of Cesare's position, Madame could not refuse him, and consciously went to his manipulations and let him play his game with a dazzling smile and charm. Cesare said it was wonderful. And Madame Flavia, grasping her forehead, told the gentleman that he was really Cesare suggested that handsome, but the woman said very resourceful. Then the young man said that this was the reason why the girls gave him their young hearts. Cesare's gaze turned toward the sister who stood behind Madame Flavia and looked at him with a serious look. He said that he had not realized that she was going to take a bath and should have come in a little later in that case. Mimi. Flavia reproached the gentleman, saying that he ought not to say such a thing so carelessly. What would he do if that one made up all sorts of nonsense after hearing it? Adele looked away with annoyance. She was uncomfortable with being called that ones without even asking her own opinion on the matter. Continuing to smile, Cesare said that the look on Adelaide's face said that she was definitely not going to make up anything, and even hurt his male ego a little with it. Madame Flavia was outraged that the girl dared to raise her eyes and began to shout at her. The woman's eyes squinted. She approached Adele and abruptly pulled away her negligee, exposing a shoulder covered with bruises. Still screaming, me? Flavia asked. What are those ugly marks? Adele replied that it was nothing serious and the bruises would soon fade, leaving no imperfections on her body. It certainly wouldn't interfere with their plan. Cesare watched seriously at what was happening, letting the madam scream. The woman turned around to him and exclaimed that this wretch wouldn't fit. After all, they don't even know where she used to hang around. Not only could she have been beaten by drunken beggars while she was selling her body, but she still had scars. Even among the lower class, she's the bottom. People like her are lazy and have no inner core. If she had 100 years, she wouldn't even come close to looking like an aristocrat. And her intentions of participating in the plan is probably to raise her status by using her body. These words deeply offended Adele. She was trading her body. Was she lazy and selfish? Did she want to deceive everyone? How could this woman judge her so confidently without knowing anything about her past? Images of her past life immediately flashed before her eyes. How the patron, drunk and playing cards, shouted at her that she was foolish and forbade her to look at him so that she would not think him pathetic. How customers would shove her to the ground, yelling that she didn't know how to shine shoes. How people from the shops came and demanded debts from her. Every day she diligently cleaned dozens, hundreds of shoes, endlessly paid her debts, but she proudly lived this way, without an extra piece of bread, believing it was better than trading her body for easy money and food. Never had she allowed anyone to touch her body. But Adele suppressed the indignation within her. Clutching her hand firmly on her negligee, apologizing to Madame, the girl said she knew she lacked a lot, but she would try harder. Madame Flavia began to shout even louder. How was she going to hide her true origin with such efforts? Does she really think she can deceive the eyes of those born and raised in high society? Where did she get such arrogance from, living her whole life at the bottom? Every word was a slap in the face. Adele said that she had grown up without parents and had no education, so she couldn't know if it was possible, but her brother thought she could fool everyone by bringing her here. She skillfully managed to turn the situation around so that all the insults now sounded like a rebuke to Cesare's competence and confidence. Adele then added that if Madame thought her brother was mistaken in his judgment, why not discuss it with him personally? Madame Flavia was silent, And Cesare looked at his sister with pleasure and a little pride that the girl did not keep silent, though it was not the best position to take. Adele told Madame Flavia that she had never studied and did not know whether her words had crossed the line, but she hoped she could be forgiven. The woman clutched her cane tightly in her hand and wanted to insult the girl, but at that moment Cesare coughed, as if to suggest that Madame should not allow herself such behavior in his presence. The woman put her hat back on her head with an angry look and said that she had completely forgotten about the appointment, so she had to go, and bowed to Mr. Sayer. The young gentleman told Adele that she, his little sister, was no slouch and knew what to say to stand up for herself. The girl, holding up her robe, thanked him, hoping he hadn't seen her bruises. But then Cesare added that the girl's character was not adaptive, and because of that Madame Flavia would have a hard time training her. He was saying that if she had been more gentle, things might have gone much more smoothly. Although you can't say it right away, Madame is a very sensitive person. Adele was surprised and asked her brother if he meant that she should have pretended to be pathetic. Cesare hummed and said she was already pathetic. Why should she pretend? She'd been pathetic all her life. Was it strange that that fact was unchanged now? And suggested calling what was going on a play. So Adele could somehow determine which action would be a reasonable choice without consequences. Moving closer to the girl and leaning over her ear, Cesare asked what she thought of it. Once again, he called her by her fake name, Adelaide. Adele realized it was a provocation and bowed to her brother, asking for his forgiveness. She noted to herself that he had decided to mock her once more to see her reaction, and accordingly she had to feign the submission she had not shown to Madame Flavia to show him that she could be. The girl then said aloud that she would do her best to live up to her brother's expectations, but decided in her mind that she did not intend to become a court jester either. Cesare silently turned around and said wistfully that everyone becomes uninteresting so quickly. Adele silently looked after her brother, not understanding his reaction. Apparently, he wanted to see more of her character, and the indicator of submissiveness showed that she was as boring as all the other girls. The next day, Adele was able to get ready and dressed on time. Her classes with Madame Flavia were starting. Walking down the corridor, the girl asked Effanie if Madame had really come back to take over her training. The maid asked the madam not to worry and opened the door to a spacious white-colored hall. White stone sculptures were arranged all over the hall. Effanie quietly told Madame that if the young master had made up his mind, it must surely be fulfilled. Madame Flavia had been displeased since morning. She gave the name of the new pupil, Adele Buonaparte, and added that such a one as she could not bear that noble surname. It was inconceivable that a great blue star should hang on her breast, and then said she was sure the sea goddess would be angry when she heard of it. Mr. Cesare ordered that Adelaide be made a lady, but Madame Flavia said she thought the girl should be taught a lesson, and demanded the girl sit on her knees. Adele asked again, and then meme. Flavia, calling her deaf, repeated her order once more. Adele did not understand why this woman was taking her anger out on her, just because she was not of noble birth. Because she's a dirty shoe shiner. Is she trying to hurt her with this attitude? If so, Madame Flavia has chosen an entirely inappropriate method, for there can be no honor in the knees of shoe shiners. Me. Flavia came closer and placed her foot on the girl's knee, then with a violent push told Adele that she was merchandise, and to be quietly sold to the Della Valle family was her only purpose, and if she should suddenly aim at anything more, she would go to the sharks for food. After that, Madame asked the girl if she understood. Adele replied that she understood. Then Madame told her to get up. They started the lesson. To begin, Madame Flavia decided to put the girl's gait. Effanie brought a box as ordered by Madame and opened it, revealing small black shoes. Madame Flavia told Adele that these shoes were needed to correct her crooked gait. Henceforth, she would have to wear only this pair, even when she is not in Madame's class. At first, Adele was a little excited about the new shoes, but upon putting them on, she felt a shooting pain. They were small and quite a bit too small at that. Her toes were bent completely, and were showing from the edge of the shoes, and her skin was reddened. At first, Adele wanted to tell Madame Flavia about it, thinking it was a mistake and the woman had accidentally ordered the wrong size, but she immediately realized that the woman had done it intentionally, in order to make the lessons unbearable, and the girl gave in. Madame Flavia, feeling her superiority and victory, told the girl to get up and start walking. And with a pointer she showed from which place in the hall and to which she would have to walk back and forth. Adele must walk until Madame allowed her to stop. Walking across the hall without stopping, after another fall to the floor, Adele kicked off her shoes, unable to bear the pain. She could no longer walk in them. Then Madame Flavia asked her what she was allowing herself during the sacred lesson. Absolutely no desire to learn. Immediately, she started shouting that the girl didn't deserve to carry the Bonaparte surname and should get out of here immediately. After shouting, the woman smirked, rejoicing in her final victory. Yes, this was exactly how Madame Flavia had imagined the girl losing. But that was only her fantasy. In reality, no matter how bad the pain was, Adele did not give up and walked around the hall for hours without uttering a word, and never. Because of her unimaginably small shoes, the girl was breathing heavily, trying to cope with the pain, and sweat was running down her forehead. But in a few hours, she never once asked for a break. Without expressing any emotion with her face, Adele asked the madam if she could do another lap. At this moment, she looked incredibly graceful, which made the teacher even angrier. Madam thought to herself that because of her background, this girl was willing to perform all sorts of foolishness with persistence, and her patience was bursting for the day. Madam turned to the maid and asked her to leave the hall for a while. Ifoni apologized to Madame as the young master had ordered her not to leave the lady's side. Madame Flavia said she would personally report the matter to Mr. Cesare. She then promised that she would not flog the girl and swore on the name of Lorraine. Ifoni had nothing more to object to, and she went out. Madame Flavia, calling Adele a Shushiner, told her directly to leave the mansion. The girl calmly replied that this task was different from the intention of the gentleman who had brought her here. The madam on that said that she was the one who was talking to her right now. Compared to Bonaparte, the descendants of the Delaval family are not such a posh lot to marry, and yet they are definitely superior to someone as lazy and shallow as Adele. Therefore, if Adele understood her position, she must go. Madame promised to guarantee the girl's safety, and would naturally take care of the consolation payment. Adele was silent at first, and afterward said that it appeared that Madame wished her brother to bind himself in marriage to Lady Lucretia. The girl thought that Madame had come here with the intention of carrying out her brother's will. Yet it was not so at all. Then the girl began to turn towards the exit, and apologizing to Madame, said that she was obliged to inform her brother of this fact. Madame Flavia was frightened, and blurted out that it was the will of Madame Cesare's grandmother. The contract between Delaval and Bonaparte is a very old and now unfashionable story. However, if it were not for this contract, would Mr. Cesare have married? He is a man on whom countless women look. He still won't settle down and continues to act like a little child. What if the noble lineage is broken? Such a thing cannot be allowed to happen. After that, Madame Flavia told Adele that she was getting into a battle of the Titans. The girl bowed to Madame and thanked her for the warning. However, she still can't do her bidding. Madame became angry and, calling Adele selfish, demanded that she say so and so wanted to beg for more money. Adele replied that she did not, thinking of all sorts of desserts. The girl confessed that she was doing it because she really liked the local food. Madame Flavia did not understand her. Then Adele said that money and the future are really luxuries for her. For those who struggle to live each day, promises to the future are just a mirage. After all, this is the thing that she can't eat right now. Madame said irritably that the girl was also proud of the fact that she had hidden her mind away with hunger. Isn't that the behavior of an animal? Adele replied that Madame was right. She had no choice but to live like that. She couldn't sleep for hunger. And there were times when Adele would sit on stale barley bread for a month. She lived a life of uncertainty, worrying only about whether she would be able to eat. Therefore, there was only one thing she could answer Madame. She bowed in curtsy and said, "Excuse me." Even though it was Madame's order, she had no intention of leaving the Bonaparte mansion. When evening came, Madame Flavia finished her lesson and walked down the corridor, thinking about what had happened. Even though Adele's movements were a little awkward, even so, her whole body directly radiated tenderness and elegance the moment she bowed to her. And after all, she was wearing those little shoes. Such a thing was absolutely impossible. So why? Madame grabbed her head, not understanding why her imagination would keep drawing Cesare and Adele together. Feeling fearful for the gentleman's reputation, Madame decided to find another way to kick Adele out of the manor as soon as possible. A week of lessons with Madame Flavia had passed. Adele didn't even realize how one day was succeeding another, so fast the time was passing. Speech, etiquette, small talk, the rules of socializing with noble ladies of higher status, practicing how to politely refuse a gentleman's advances. and perfecting her gait. To this day, she walked in tight shoes and endured the pain. Adele strolled through the garden with Efoni, sheltering from the sun with an umbrella. Noticing that the girl was walking heavily, the maid asked if her feet were all right. Adele replied that they were fine. But Efoni couldn't calm down. She said that, in fact, Madame Flavia must have seen for herself that Madame's gait has become perfect. Besides, Madame Flavia's learning speed was simply staggering. It was enough to explain something only once, and Mistress Adelaide absorbed all the information like a sponge. She could walk beautifully with a book on her head and could wield a fan. Of course, she still needed practice, but even now, no one would think that she was in the lower class. Adele only said, "That's how it is." But in the end, she didn't complain about the pain in her legs. The attention of both of them was drawn to a noise in another part of the garden. On a small bridge, there were several ladies standing near the gazebos. They were talking loudly amongst themselves and laughing. Adele told Efoni that she had not seen them before and asked who the ladies were. The maid replied that they were members of a delegation from Orkinen. Adele then asked what were they doing in the mansion. Efoni said that the lady was so busy teaching that no news reached her. A few days ago, a second prince ascended to the throne of Orkinen, and it happened thanks to the support of the young Lord Cesare. Since the prince had no supporters in the palace, a lot of effort was required of him, but in the end it all worked out. In gratitude for his help, the Emperor of Orkinen gave the young lord a generous gift. So it's extremely lively here now. Everyone is celebrating Cesare's success. Adele thought that the impact on the succession in the neighboring country was really strong, and her brother's sphere of influence was much wider than she thought. The girl standing on the bridge spotted the Duke in the gazebo. Cesare greeted them, wishing them good morning. Efoni noticed him too and said so aloud. Looking at her brother's back, Adele thought he was a true favorite of fate and the gods, the ladies' man of the Bonaparte family, the man who represents the blessing of the sea goddess. He is the man in whose honor such dithyrambs are sung. Yet why did Adele not see him as interested? He looked at everything with a cheerful smile, but his eyes betrayed his indifference to everything. He seemed rather devastated looking at the ladies that surrounded him, though that was hardly possible. Efoni told the mistress that they had better leave before they were spotted. Adele agreed and they walked off deep into the garden. Cesare noticed them and watched them leave. One of the girls asked him what he saw so interesting among the trees. The man replied that there seemed to be a mermaid. The girl wanted to look that way, but Cesare covered her eyes with his palm and said that there was an equally beautiful mermaid there too. The girl was embarrassed and called him a joker. The young gentleman said she liked that and whispered in her ear that she should come to him today. He would be waiting for her. The girl replied that she would come if he promised to think about their relationship in a more serious way. Cesare remained silent with a smile. But in his mind, he thought that, judging by the nonsense, she started to talk. It was time to end communication with her. He didn't understand why these ladies were trying to give any seriousness to their brief affair of a couple nights. He touched the girl's hair and thought that those golden locks used to seem quite alluring to him. But even that was boring now. Somewhere all feelings went away and Adele's emerald and sea-colored hair began to shimmer in his mind. In the end, Cesare told the girl that it was very nice and cheeky, after which he turned his back to her. This brought out some conflicting emotions in the guest. She was angry, but she didn't want to see Cesare's indifference. Therefore, despite his refusal, almost crying, told him that she would come to him. But Caesar replied that it would be better if she went home. The young duke left the ladies near the arbor. The other girls comforted the unfortunate blonde who was broken heart. Cesar himself found the spectacle a sheer bore. He went deep into the garden. He lit a cigar and set out to find Adele. He could clearly see which way she'd gone, but he couldn't see her anywhere else. Suddenly, he heard his sister screaming from someone demanding to be let go. He turned in the direction from which the sound came and saw Adelaide, all wet, sitting in the fountain, trying to pull out her hand which was held tightly by a man. Earlier, Adelaide found each step harder and harder to take. The shooting pain was unbearable and eventually the girl fell to her knees. Efoni ran up to the mistress and told her that this would not do. She asked to be allowed to immediately check the condition of the girl's feet, and when she removed her shoes, she was horrified at what she saw. The feet were wiped down to blood, and where she wasn't, there were gruesome blisters and calluses. Efoni said it was too much, and the mistress could no longer walk in those shoes. Drenching herself in sweat, Adele asked the maid if she had any painkillers. pain radiated from her feet all over her body. But Adele didn't ask to ease her burden. She said that with medicine she could tolerate walking in these shoes. She intended to keep walking in them. Ifoni couldn't bear to see the girl exhausting herself and said that the class was over for today. She then added that she would bring a wheelchair, and until then Mistress could cool her feet in the water, and helped Adele to sit down on the edge of the fountain. She asked Mistress not to go anywhere and promised to be back soon. Lifting the hem of her dress, Adele lowered her wounded feet into the cool water and noticed that the pain had indeed begun to subside. She reflected that even though she was having a hard time now, it was much better than life in Camorra. Suddenly, male voices were heard very close by. 3 gentlemen were strolling through the garden, discussing something heatedly. Upon hearing better, it was clear that they were discussing Cesare and the upcoming party at the mansion, and they were walking straight towards Adele. Knowing that she was not allowed to appear in public before the appointed time, the girl decided to hide. Holding her skirt in her hands, she walked behind the fountain, hoping that the passing men wouldn't stop near it and would go around without seeing her hiding under the waterfall. One of the men told his friends that he had noticed that Lady Lucrezia was not among the guests who had arrived, though he was sure she would be Cesare's partner for the evening. Another answered him that Mr. Delaval had demanded of Lucrezia that she behave more quietly and not press Cesare. Then the first asked, had not everything been settled between their union? Adele didn't listen to them, but when the voices died down, she assumed the men had left and decided to look out of her hiding place. At that moment she bumped into one of them. He stood close to her and immediately grabbed her arm, wondering who she was, pulling her out of the fountain. The man shouted to the others that there was some damsel hiding here. Adele broke free and fell into the water, unable to stand on her sick legs. One of the aristocrats told the man who grabbed Adele that he was overreacting. The culprit's name was Henry. He began to justify to his friend that he did nothing, and the girl herself fell. Adele dove out and clung to the side of the fountain. The men opened their mouths, finally seeing how beautiful the girl was. That's when Henry said that he seemed to have captured not a girl, but a real mermaid. He leaned over Adele and asked who she was. Judging by the missing shoes, she didn't look like a noblewoman or a lady, but her clothes were too good for a servant girl. Adele only looked at him angrily and answered nothing. Henry said there was a price to be paid for silence and grabbed her arm again, slyly saying that maybe that was what she was dreaming of. The other man begged Henry to stop such antics, for after all, they were on the Duke's estate. But Henry shouted back that he didn't care, and why should he even think of any Buonaparte when he touched a maid? The man began to ask his companion to speak more quietly, but Henry became more and more atomized, and shouted that Buonaparte had made himself king, or else why was everybody so afraid of him? Adele said seriously that if her arm was pulled any harder, it would come off. The men tensed up as they realized that the girl was talking like an aristocrat. Adele told them that if they didn't stop, they would regret it. But these words only made the men even more interested, and they only laughed in response. Their minds began to run through the options of what exactly could she have been. A governess, certainly not an aristocrat. With such rough hands, she could only be a girl of easy virtue, summoned from a brothel, nothing more. She must have come to work, and there's a lot of customers here. They began to hover over the girl more and giggle worriedly. Adele began to panic and started to break free from Henry's clutches, screaming that she was asking him to let her go. Then Henry began to yell back that she couldn't get human treatment from the scumbag Cesare anyway. And even though he didn't know how she got into the mansion, but as long as he was asking nicely, she should silently strip. At these words, they noticed Cesare standing behind them, just listening to them. They exclaimed with glee, "Mr. Cesare." But the Duke asked them if there were any such people here. He had heard of Mesrawit's Cesare, but of Mr. Cesare nothing at all. And he asked, was it not so? Gurney Fetcha? Coming closer, Cesare said that the head of the Fetch family would surely enjoy the story. At his age, wearing sweats to and from Buonaparte Manor, all for the sake of trying to borrow a few coins. With a smile and a laugh, stopping close enough to Henry, Cesare also said that Mr. Fetch had even brought his wife with him, in order to elicit more pity and mercy from the Duke. Such words about his parents aroused Henry's anger, and he, showering the Duke with insults, wanted to lash out at him and put up a fight. The two companions stopped their friend from making a mistake and asked the Duke to stop as well, as he himself was out of line. Caesar put his hand on Henry's shoulder and said that treating his little sister like a prostitute was what overstepping boundaries meant. His look was no longer cheerful. It radiated cold fury. Gurney stood as if stooped, realizing the full horror of what awaited him. Was this girl in the fountain really Mr. Cesare's sister? It could not be. No one had ever heard of her, and no one had ever seen her before. Cesare walked past the men, and throwing his jacket over his sister's shoulders, asked Adelaide how could this have happened. There was excitement and freedom in his mind and appearance. Adele realized it was only a play, and Cesare was playing it perfectly. Looking obliquely at the men, the girl hesitantly asked her brother why he was here. Henry shouted for Cesare not to lie. He had no sister. Every fish in the sea knew it. Cesare turned around and angrily replied that he didn't have one before, but now he did. Apparently his parents still have a perfect marital harmony. Except, does he have to go into explanations? Henry said it wasn't his fault. Who would recognize her as a lady, looking at her like that? She was sitting in the fountain barefooted and wounded. After saying that, Cesare glanced at Adele's feet, who was trying to hide them while sitting in the water. The girl apologized and said that she did not wish to disgrace the name of Bonaparte and had practiced tirelessly so that her feet were badly hurt. She admitted that she had sent Afoni for help as it was difficult to walk, but she had not even thought that such a disgusting situation could happen in Bonaparte's territory. Cesare lifted his sister in his arms and said that he had asked the girl not to overdo it, and disgrace was out of the question. There was no need to torment herself to such a degree for such a thing. Then Adelaide asked her brother, what if she became a laughingstock in social circles? It's in the family too. Cesare kissed the girl on the forehead and said that there should be no such talk between family members. Adele froze. Her eyes opened wide. She was surprised at this behavior of the indifferent Cesare, and even more surprised at the word family. She had never had a family, and hearing that word spoken to her was unfamiliar. She had never heard it in her entire life. Not even in jest did all aristocrats behave like that to their loved ones. How would the daughter of a noble family react to warm reassurances after the stress she'd been through? Deciding she should return the same sensitivity, Adele drew her brother's hand to her face and kissed his cheek, thanking him for his concern. Cesare smiled at his sister. Henry and his companions began to whisper quietly that it seemed they were indeed brother and sister. They were indeed very similar in appearance to each other, and were close. Cesare turned back to the men and asked if they still wished to have fun with his little sister. The startled aristocrats said they were just kidding. Plus, the other two tried to stop Henry, and they really didn't know that this girl was the Lord's younger sister. Then Cesare asked, by their logic, if she wasn't his sister, then this kind of behavior is considered acceptable. The men said it wasn't true at all. It was just a joke. Cesare told them not to worry so much, and then the men exclaimed, "They are forgiven." But Cesare told them that he too could have accidentally tortured someone without knowing that they were members of their families, but since that would be the case, he hoped for their forgiveness as he forgives them now. After that, Cesare, continuing to carry his sister in his arms, walked off deep into the garden towards the mansion. Adele felt uncomfortable. The water made her feel cold, and she tried to wrap herself as deeply as possible in her jacket. Cesare, feeling that he was still under the gaze of the aristocrats lurking among the trees, continued the play. With a smile, he inquired if his sister was comfortable and promised that they would be inside very soon. Once they were inside, Cesare, removing his mask of civility, asked irritably why he had to do who knows what. Adele apologized and said she was about to get off. But as soon as her toes touched the floor, pain shot through her again. Cesare didn't pick her up, dropped the hands that had previously held her up, and she fell to the floor. There was no trace of brotherly love left. Cesare stood and looked down at the girl, not caring at all about her condition. The young duke said it was just a disaster and asked where Afoni was. Adele replied that she couldn't walk, so Afoni went to get a wheelchair. Cesare said that wasn't what they'd agreed on, and he didn't recall hiring a cripple who couldn't even walk normally. Adele began to apologize, explaining that she hadn't thought she'd meet anyone near the fountain. And that's when the pain became truly hellish. She looked back and saw that Cesare had stood on her sore feet and was pressing down on them with force. With a menacing look, Cesare, calling her Adelaide, asked what the girl's sick fantasies were. Did she enjoy having fun with a bunch of men, or was it a habit left over from the slums? If there's a reason for it, anyone will do. Adele was shocked. Cesare was literally making her feel guilty about the situation, as if she wanted to be molested. He knew full well that wasn't the case. So why was she the victim, being made to look guilty for it? Pressing his feet even harder, he asked if there was another reason why there was misbehavior going on at Buonaparte Manor. Shivering with her whole body and enduring the pain, Adele asked if her brother meant to say that she had seduced those men. Cesare replied that she knew better. Adele then turned around to face him and said she didn't. Cesare began to laugh, and Adele stared in amazement, completely unaware of what was going on in the man's head. Having laughed enough, Cesare said that Madame Flavia was being rather hard on herself. At last he realized that the fault of the pain in her feet was the narrow shoes she had made the unfortunate girl wear, almost making her an invalid. It was not this that he was dissatisfied with, but her behavior in the fountain. She had not shown herself in any way there. She only silently tried to throw up her hands. If she could not escape, she had to show herself a proud aristocrat. Pressing her feet again, Caesar asked the girl directly, could she not do anything properly? At least to get into verbal battles and shamefully lose? At least to get her way by ingratiation and coquetry? She had so many options in her arsenal. And she was especially good at discarding pride and pleading. So why didn't she use her skills like she always did and let this happen? Adele couldn't say anything, holding back cries of pain, covering her mouth with her fist as the pain receded a little. She said she was wrong and made a mistake. Cesare pulled away from her feet and said he was glad she at least realized that. He then demanded that she treat the wounds, so that no blemish would be left behind. The bloody feet were left with the dirty sole marks from the boots. At that moment, Aphone burst into the room. She wanted to say something to the young gentleman, but Cesare interrupted her and said that if she wanted to explain herself, she would do it later. As he left the room, he said that classes would be cancelled for 3 days, a period of time in which Adelaide should get in order. After that, he slammed the doors loudly. Aphone was left looking regretfully at the unfortunate girl lying on the floor in a semi-conscious state. In the evening of the same day, at sunset, sitting in his study and smoking a cigar, Cesare reflected on what had happened. Going through the papers, he read the dossier on Henry, his family, and went over again in his mind the whole day's scandal. A second son with no right to inherit the lineage and just trash incapable of being a separate entity. And this lowlife was doing nasty things in Buonaparte's garden? They had lost all fear, and Cesare was determined to see this matter through to the end. But the plan for his sister's debut had already gone awry. Adelaide's identity had been revealed, which meant there was no way to choose another candidate to play the sister if Adele failed to fulfill the role or prepare for the 3-month deadline. Now he was obligated to make the Shushin girl into a Buonaparte by all means. This morning's picture was definitely provocative. Wet emerald hair like seaweed glistening on the water surface, skin as white as salt, overly lush breasts in a tight raw dress. Those men would surely lustfully recall what they saw today. Though, to be honest, Cesare himself was aroused when Adelaide kissed him on the cheek, and then looked at him with a serious gaze while looking like a fairy tale nymph. Right in front of his face, so close, Cesare pondered this on the balcony, and finally decided that since even he had fallen for her beauty, the game would be over as soon as Ezra Della Val saw her for the first time. Cesare heard a knock and told his guest to come in. The doors of the study swung open, and Madame Flavia stepped inside. Cesare smoked in silence for a while and then said he didn't really care how she taught that despicable one, but he'd rather she didn't work too hard. Madame, lowering her head, apologized. Cesare, in a sterner voice, said not to be pestered again. Madame Flavia is a wise woman and should have understood what he meant. After this brief conversation, the woman left the office. She was immediately enveloped in anger. Flavia had decided that Adele was very cunning and had deliberately tormented herself until she had trampled all her feet. Thus she, Madame Flavia, might eventually fall into Buonaparte's disfavor, not recognizing her own mistakes and certainly not intending to treat Adele more gently. Madame Flavia showered her with insults and curses, and resolved never to let the girl spoil her relations with Mr. Fee.
Cesare!
As Cesare had predicted, the plan had indeed changed. The girls that had peeped in the garden began to talk about the girl who was completely damp and shoeless that Cesare carried in his arms. They were not yet aware that this was his sister, and they began to wonder who this stranger was. Many did not believe it, but they could not help but agree that even though she was barefoot, Mr. Cesare would not mess with a commoner. In any case, they are far from having the most casual relationship, and many have heard that they entered the main wing together, and Mr. Cesare was much more affectionate with her than he usually was. The other girls said that Mr. Cesare never brought girls through the main wing. One of the ladies with lush red hair, after hearing all the rumors, stood up abruptly and said that she was not feeling well and that she would have to go home. The other girls, calling her Lady Genevieve, asked her to be careful. As they were crossing the bridge, Genevieve shouted to them that the sea goddess would protect them. She was obviously in a hurry to get somewhere. One of the girls asked why the lady might be ill, to which the other replied that she was only pretending. Walking as fast as her heels would allow, Genevieve hurried to tell her friend, Lady Lucretia, about the rumors. When she got to her room, she began to write a letter. It sounded as follows. Autumn is in full swing at Fornati, and the day when your house arrest ends is just around the corner. You will be shocked, but Genevieve cannot fail to inform you that a dark cloud hangs over the lady's future. Today, from the accounts of the ladies who gathered at the Buonaparte estate to admire the mermaid's heart, I learned that Mr. Cesare was caught with a girl in his arms, whom he carried right into the main wing of the mansion. How many more times does Mr. Cesare intend to stab my friend's heart before he is finally satisfied? And what's more, who is this shameless woman who has enticed him? Genevieve wishes to meet the lady as soon as possible and give her comfort. Hugs, your friend, Genevieve. She then sealed the letter in a red envelope, sealed it with gold sealing wax, and ordered the servants to take it to the de Laval estate. The letter arrived quickly enough. Lady Lucrezia opened the envelope while standing by the fireplace in her room. She could not understand what unbelievable nonsense the letter contained. If it was true, did Mr. Cesare really want her feelings? Why had he been tormenting her for so long? When would his affairs end? She threw the letter into the fire, and in her eyes she could read the anger hidden in her soul. She would definitely not leave things as they are and start playing her own game.